So today I'm going to be presenting my research on Kendrick Lamar's Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers in relation to African American lived experiences. So to begin, hip hop is a musical genre of popular music that was developed in the United States by African Americans, Caribbean Americans, and Latino Americans in the Bronx Borough of New York in the 1970s. It is also recalled that the histories of this music was identified to begin at the Cross Bronx, at the incursion of the Cross Bronx Expressway into the South Bronx as a major catalyst in the music. So it's important for us to study hip hop because it serves as an instrumental voice to African Americans, as obviously they used it as expression for the injustices and the issues that they face. They also use it as a liberation through art and to find their true voice in society. So we must look at it at face value and uncover the truth behind this source or this primary source of history. So to start my literature review, I'd like to explore Kellen Northcutt's peer-reviewed journal, Jay-Z and OJ, Sport and Performance of Race in Hip Hop Music. So she explores the relationship between hip hop's messaging and the lived experiences of African Americans and their realities through a content analysis, and she analyzes the data that she finds through the critical race theory. In this study specifically, he takes a deep dive into Jay-Z's song, The Story of OJ, to interpret the impact of Black Americans' lived experiences on their identity and the ability to progress economically and socially, regardless of societal standing. So in all, he identified 3 different themes. First being the battle with Blackness, second, economic enslavement and financial freedom, and third, systematic subjugation. So additionally, this data exposes a culture of racism in many subcultures of American society. It is clear that these difficulties are endemic within the systemic policies and institutions. And additionally, I would like to explore Elizabeth Grant's research on gangster rap, the war on drugs, and the location of African American identity in Los Angeles from 1988 to 1992. In this study, she studied how the birth of rap in South Central LA and the war on drugs spatialized identity structure on race relations in their city. So in her case study, she identified that African Americans reflect their city or inner city Black experiences in the form of hip hop. As these rappers became commercially successful, they portrayed an urban identification that was defined by their gangster image and tried to keep it real. But as this gangster rap image established racialization in LA, it began to be used against them. And an example of this was when economic changes and gentrification happened in LA. This gangster identity was used to formulate batteries in the city, and this soon created a spatialized racial dynamic that was abused as LA's municipal interests manipulated this gangster's image on the war on drugs campaign and used it to criminalize them and created a tension between real and imagined gangsters. So this all led me to ask the question, how does Kendrick Lamar's personal growth that is testified in his most recent album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, compare to the continuity and change of African American lived experiences? So to perform our research, I utilized a mixed methods approach. First, I did a case study of Kendrick Lamar's personal experience through his most recent album through the use of content analysis. Then after doing so, evaluated and compared his past life experiences from his earlier album to Pimp a Butterfly. And by doing so, or to do so, I used past research. And then lastly, I compared my findings in relation to the African American community. For the data, I obviously chose this album because it's his most recent work of art, and it best represents the current standing of African American lived experiences and his personal experience. And then in order to do my content analysis, I used a program called MaxQDA, which is a software that aids in content analysis. So first, I downloaded the lyrics into the program, then I read them the first go around, and second, then I highlighted codes, which were words and phrases that related to the Black American experience and Kendrick Lamar's specific experience. And then after that, I used the paraphrase feature to explain any implications of the lyrics and how it might relate to those experiences. And then lastly, I grouped these codes into themes, which I use for my analysis. And then after that, for my comparative analysis, I compared these findings to the previous studies on To Pimp a Butterfly. So the first theme that I came upon was community and upbringing. So it's really important to understand where he was raised and where he was born, which was Compton, California. This is a town that is crime-ridden and deals with a lot of poverty. And in his music, he talks about being a pit bull to this. So essentially, he's a product of an environment, just like a pit bull adapts to his surroundings at home. And then as a result of this, he creates poor habits, and he falls into the pressure to be the stereotypical man and falls into the gangster culture that he's surrounded by. And then lastly, he constantly fights outside threats due to the cyclical nature of violence, crime, poverty, and imprisonment. Secondly, I found the theme of family. It's also important to recognize that although he was in the presence of both his parents, they were not always necessarily positive figures. So this is exemplified by his relationship with his father. His father taught him to have a callous mentality and that he must always be tough and hustle through exhaustion, because that was his only way, that was his own experience and his only way of survival. And in doing so, he must hide his emotions and almost embrace this stoic persona that wasn't allowed to show any type of vulnerability. And these childhood experiences left him with unresolved tensions leading into his adulthood. And one result of this tension and trauma that he endured was broken relationships in his own adult life. And this could be as a result of his infidelity, toxic arguments, and hurt, which are all seen in the album. And this just continues the generational cycles. However, this does turn around for the better, which will soon be discussed later in this presentation. And then thirdly, the theme of trauma occurred in the album. So as a result of these factors that were previously described, it's evident that Kendrick Lamar dealt with a lot of trauma, which was left lingering because of the stigmas and notions against therapy and self-care in his childhood and community. He discusses generational traumas, or curses as he calls them, with the Black community. One that he discusses regularly was the oppression. Second was the lack of a father figure in most of the households around him. And then third was sexual abuse. He specifically talks about the harms it inflicts on victims, sometimes leading to a victim-victimizer cycle. And then he also reflects on the lack of action his lack of action when he witnessed his own mom being abused at a young age of 5. This left him traumatized and filled with guilt that remained inside him through his childhood, until his adulthood. With the lack of resources and extended knowledge, this led to unhealthy coping mechanisms such as disenfranchised grief, materialism, and acts of infidelity. So in my comparative analysis, I used the research of James D. McLeod Jr. and Adam Wirt on To Pimp a Butterfly. And on this previous album, they recognized many highs and lows that Lamar recited as his experiences. So some of the struggles include the threat of death being omnipresent in his upbringing, the degradation of humanity due to poverty, drug and gang violence, police mistreatment, and racism. And then he also faces a tension between love for his community and being surrounded by violence. This is further examined when he recognizes his own hypocrisy of violence against his own race, which creates a contradiction between his Black pride and the gang violence around him. And then lastly, he feels guilty from leaving his community when he becomes successful and chasing pleasures over his faith in God. Then on the flip side of this, he also talks about a lot of moments of pride, strength, and triumph in his life and in his community. So ultimately, the fight between the duality of his experiences is left unresolved on this album. And this all culminates into the theme of internal change, which is heavily noted on his most recent album. So he finally overcomes his past experiences and tensions, as seen on the To Pimp a Butterfly and Mr. Morale, as his fiance convinces him to go to therapy with Eckhart Tolle, who is a spiritual teacher that helped him find his inner peace with his world-renowned teachings. This took him through a long and deep introspection. In short, in this process, he was able to ultimately confront his pain and suffering. One big triumph for him specifically was absolving his ego and the outward attitude that led him to finding his authentic self and a sense of intrinsic confidence. And as a result of his work on himself, he was able to heal the generational curses, which led to healthier, healed relationship with his fiance and his own children. Now his previously unresolved traumas will not inflict his children like they did to him, and he'll continue to uplift throughout his life and his children's lives. And then at the end of this album, Kendrick Lamar uplifts. His uplift calls others to follow his example and purify themselves as well. So in my study, I came upon two specific limitations. So due to the complexity of the album and his own experiences, it lends the opportunity to explore a nuance. So I was limited by the 5,000 word count. And then secondly, his own individual experiences can't be generalized to everybody in the community, even in his own community at home, because everyone's individual experience is unique to their own. And then for future studies, I had three different suggestions. First, I offered a direct comparative analysis between this album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, and his next album that he'll eventually put out in the future, and see the progression and change in himself and his reflections on the community. And then secondly, I said that you could replicate the same study, but with a stricter comparative analysis by using McLeod's and Wert's themes that they already derived and finding those themes in his most recent album. And then lastly, I suggest doing a case study on hip hop music and a specific demographic and location. So for instance, they could focus on artists and hip hop artists in Compton and see how that would better reflect the general experience of African Americans in that location. Thank you.